everyone to this case study webinar series. I'm just going to wait a minute or so to let people join us, and then I'll formally introduce and kick off the session. Fantastic. So good afternoon and kia ora tātou to all of those of you who have joined us on the call. Welcome to the Infrastructure Sustainability Council Sustainable Decision Making and Using the ECN-1 Credit webinar. So welcome to all. Exciting to have you here today. My name's Kerry Griffiths. I'm the Technical Director at the ISC. Before we look at today's agenda, I just want to take a moment to acknowledge country and pay my respects to the traditional owners of the land on which we are meeting today across Australia and Aotearoa, New Zealand. I am joining you from Tamaki Makaurau here in Auckland in Aotearoa, and I pay my respects to the iwi that are represented on this land. And I know we will pay our respects to individual countries that we're joining on and to their elders past, present and future. So welcome. I'm just going to take you quickly through the flow of the agenda for today, and then I'll kick off with a couple of introductory slides. So first of all, myself and Declan Collins, our regional lead from Western Australia, South Australia and Northern Territory, I think I've got that right, Declan, will set the scene. We'll then be joined by Sophie Wallace from BG&E, who will take us through examples of using the ECN-1 credit and integrating sustainability into decision making on the EastLink WA project at the planning phase. Lee Penny from Lane O'Rourke will talk to us about the work that they've done at Malconnex and MetConnex projects. And then finally, Sam Donaldson, also from Lane O'Rourke, will step outside the immediate kind of project focus to an organisational focus. And Sam will talk to us about integrating sustainability into their organisation's decision making, and that will kind of provide a wider context for the conversation that we're having today. There'll be questions and answers at the end. You can put your questions into the Q&A, and we'll pick those up at the end of the presentations. So thanks everyone for joining. Great to see so many of you on the call. Let me now just set the scene a little before I hand over to Declan. So the ECN-1 credit was added to the IS rating scheme in the most recent version of the tool. It's also, as you can see, if we go to the next slide, thanks Lauren, it's sitting in our tools in terms of our planning tools, and also in design and as-built currently, including essentials. So in the strategic planning pilot tool, ECN-1 is used to incorporate sustainability criteria and whole-of-life considerations into strategic planning decision-making. And we've noted a few of the areas there that are specifically called out. We move to the next slide, you can see that it's also included in our detailed planning tool and in design and as-built, again to incorporate sustainability criteria and whole-of-life considerations into decision-making processes for significant projects, initiatives, and that are developed in these various phases. And also clearly the whole point of doing that is to increase sustainability outcomes. I'm now going to hand over to Declan, who's going to talk a little bit about his observations and insights into how projects are approaching ECN-1, and we'll then hear from a number of projects planning and design and as-built, and as said at the organisational phase, to give us some insights into practical use. Thanks, Declan.
Thanks, Kerry. You can go to the next slide, please. So I just want to run through some more general observations and insights into the credit. So the thing I'll call out is a systematic approach to sustainable decision making. So contrary to maybe popular belief, the credit's not really about submitting MCAs for some specific initiatives, but it's more about demonstrating a systematic approach to decision making on the project. Similarly, it's not just about selecting the best option for everything, but it's more considering the opportunity cost or the trade-offs of decisions for the quadruple bottom line. The intent is it can assist the project team, the proponents and asset owners to drive more considered and responsible outcomes. So the credit must be developed and established within the very early stages of the project, really within the establishment period. And that's because often the most significant decisions occur very early on, no matter what phase of the project lifecycle you're in. And we want to reward you for that thinking. The second bit is SQP assistance. The intent is you're triaging all project-defined significant decisions through this process. So it's in your best interest to ensure that the process and the calculations, which can be more complex than it may appear on face value, are developed with some of that specialist rigor. The last point I will point out before we get into some real examples is the golden goose or the poison. So while this credit is one of my favourites, it does come with quite a warning. It can be a golden goose, or it could be a harrowing, complex and beastly poison chalice. So make sure that it's fit for purpose. And that means tailoring it to your project scope, scale, complexity, but also the types of decisions you anticipate. It's got to be practical. It can be inefficient at best or impossible at worst if it's not developed in consideration of project governance. This is not a nice app credit or really a sustainability credit per se, but it's more a quality or project change control process that drives more considered and responsible decisions. And value adding, if it is embedded into existing project change control, quality control, or governance processes, if it reflects the project context, and if it's driving decision making towards proponent, project, or stakeholder values and success factors, it can actually add a lot of value. So let's hear from our two project case studies on what this actually looks like in practice. Thank you, Sophie.
Thanks very much, Declan, and hi everyone, great to be here. So yeah, this first project presentation is going to cover decision making during the early project phases. So I've been involved in quite a few options assessments for linear infrastructure projects over the years. We can go to the next slide for this. So some of the options assessments I've been involved with have been really big and really comprehensive, and others have been much more modest. But you know, big doesn't necessarily mean better. I've seen some really good outcomes, but I've also seen some pitfalls and some unexpected outcomes as well. So the next slide is just what I'll go through today. I'll give you a summary of some of the types of decisions that can be required during the early project phases. You know, our rating was a planning rating for the EastLink WA project, and that's the main project I'll use as an example today. I'll also mention some of the opportunities and risks that are specific to the planning phase, and some of the considerations for the ECN-1 planning credit as well as some of the benefits that we saw for the EastLink project. So next slide, please. So just to give an overview of what the decision-making, I guess, requirements were for EastLink WA and the process that we came up with. So the next slide is why do we need a decision-making framework? So EastLink was developed as a collaborative contract arrangement between Main Roads, Western Australia, GHD and BG&E. And essentially our task over the 3 years of project development was to prepare the project for delivery. So, you know, after project development is finished, then you're able to go out to tender for the actual delivery of the packages. The project itself is an 80-kilometre long stretch of highway between Perth and Northam. It's the first part of the link to Adelaide, and it included upgrades to some existing roads and highways. It involved a new greenfield section of road, and as well as several urban interchanges in the sort of eastern part of Perth as well. The project achieved a silver planning rating. And there were a lot of different types of decision needed in the project, as well as when we started the project, there was limited information about stakeholder priorities and environmental and heritage values. Not to mention, there was a lot that we didn't know about geotech and hydrology and traffic and any number of other things. So decisions for planning and development for such a large scale project included everything from, in some cases, alignment selection in some areas. Some areas we needed to work out network access arrangements, as in where were roads going to connect into the Eastlink highway that we were designing. And a lot of that was in a sensitive environment as well. And then some of the decisions were sort of interchange types, within a residential setting. Desktop information was available for environment and heritage, and further studies were done as part of our project, but decisions were required long before the full information was available. So that was definitely a challenge that we had. Also, stakeholder engagement was only just commencing, so we didn't really feel that we knew everything we needed to yet about what stakeholders cared about. So we definitely felt that jumping in and doing options assessments and that sort of thing straight off was not going to be realistic for us. There were a lot of decisions to make and not great information to help us to assess them. So what we did is we looked at some models that were out there, Infrastructure Australia, for example, ATAP, to start exploring. I guess what we wanted was a model where we could explore some context first to see if we could adapt those models for our project. We needed to reflect our sustainability mindset in whatever model we adopted. Basically, our approach was that we were building infrastructure to improve how our communities function. We wanted to look beyond just the engineering solution to get those best outcomes. And we wanted options that solve a range of problems informed by the technical, social and environmental aspects. And obviously, particularly important for the credit, we wanted to document our reasoning for future phases. And not just for the credit, but also because that would minimise rework or loss of knowledge between project phases. So we had a lot to get through, and a lot of it had to happen in parallel as well. And many work streams could not progress until a decision was made. So we couldn't wait until we had everything perfect. So next slide, thanks. So having seen the strengths and weaknesses of some MCAs on previous projects, I do always encourage projects to do that upfront thinking first. MCAs can be attractive because they seem to promise some science that will help to make sense of things. And definitely MCAs are a really useful sense-making tool because our brains are not good at weighing up multiple aspects. And these tools can help to show us where things that we would find it hard to see otherwise. But they do have pitfalls. A spreadsheet with numbers in it can definitely give a false sense of security, and Declan touched on this as well. Things might not be quite as quantifiable as they look. And it's important also for humans to still make the decisions. The MCA is just there to inform a decision, and the outputs need to be tested. So the next slide gives an overview of the 6 steps that we decided we wanted to work through. We had a really keen team who wanted to jump in and solve all the problems. You put a whole bunch of problems in front of them and they just want to solve all of them straight away. So the early steps in this process weren't necessarily on their radar or even particularly welcome necessarily initially, but the first few steps are intended to help the team to explore first before jumping to the solutions and the what ifs. The framework really is intended to guide the team's process for decision making, but also who should be involved and when, what risks might come up, particularly since there was some information that wasn't certain, and how those risks can be managed, and also to be clear on who's the ultimate decision maker. Certainly, we weren't going for perfect, we were going for practical, given we had a lot of things going on in parallel. So next slide, thanks. The ECN-1 credit also asks projects to define which decisions are significant, and the significance of a decision needs to be viewed through a few different lenses. The indicators we used for significance on Eastlink included things like how wide-ranging were the impacts. You know, was it just a local interchange where it didn't really affect too much beyond that interchange, or was it going to mean a really big change for a whole suburb? Another example of what would make something significant would be if there were really significant uncertainties or a really rapidly evolving issue of some kind. And where that was the case, it just meant we would respond to that by bringing in more people to kind of talk through what that might look like, more people across the team. So next slide, thanks. So now for some opportunities, constraints and risks relevant to the planning stage. Next slide is really around those opportunities. We know that the biggest opportunity for improving sustainability outcomes happens early on, before the project is too locked in. For EastLink, we were really keen to not lose that opportunity. And as mentioned earlier, our task was to prepare the project for delivery. So this included confirming funding requirements, for example. It also involved a lot of engagement with stakeholders and building partnerships as well to set the project up for the future, and developing the delivery scope. As a large project, the potential social and environmental impacts were significant, and we wanted to make sure that these were properly considered as part of all the major decisions that we made. In some locations, the alignment was still flexible, and I mentioned network access strategies as well in the rural section, and interchange forms needed to be decided. So the next slide talks about our streamlining decision making, because our upfront review of those decision types that we would need to make on the project informed the process that did suit our project the best. We were able to streamline some of those more simple decisions and find just a quick method to get those done in a good way. Some decisions needed an upfront meeting to make sure that the design team understood what the priorities were for environment and stakeholders. And then there were some decisions which were much more complex and hard to define, and much more difficult to untangle the various aspects. So we made sure that we allocated our team's time to properly consider those decisions rather than the more simple kind of ones. So the next slide, I guess, talks about the first step in our process. Step one, it was to properly define the problem, because definitely time can be wasted if we start to answer the wrong question. You know, we had to be clear, for example, whether we were trying to design to optimize for safety, or were we trying to review an earlier design that had been done and now we needed to consider new issues for that, or were we trying to develop an alternative design? I mean, that seems like a pretty basic question, but it's amazing how tangled up the team managed to get itself sometimes when we went off on the wrong path. So we needed to check if we were starting to answer the next perceived question as well before finding an answer to the current one, you know, getting too far ahead of ourselves. In planning, definitely the beginnings and endings can be a little unclear. So the next slide is just a quick example. Between Bakers Hill and Clackline, which is in the rural section of the project, was a section where we were looking at alignment options. So, you know, does the road go more to the north or more to the south, but also trying to minimise impacts to stakeholder engagement, stakeholder and environment with that. And we were also trying to connect into the regional road network and consider various freight movements across and along our alignment. There was a lot going on in this little space, and we had to work out where to start. So we brought together the stakeholder engagement and environment leads pretty early on to help to break down that decision into bite-sized pieces, and with the engineering design team as well, obviously. What we wanted to do was avoid wasting time. So we spent a bit of time talking about context, but also what the options were that were for that particular intersection. Only to, like, what we were concerned is we would have spent a lot of time if we focused on, say, an intersection decision, only to find out later that the alignment had to move, and maybe that intersection moved to a completely different location. So breaking it down early was helpful in that case. So the next slide is about the problem definition stage, which is more in terms of understanding the context, but how do we use that to come up with suitable criteria for deciding between options? Those criteria in a project as large as this, in terms of it's got urban and rural areas in it, the criteria were going to be different for different decisions. So we needed to think about all of that kind of thing, and having the whole cross-disciplinary team working on that was helpful. Then the next slide is about the options identification step. So going through all of that discussion really does help to manage the risk that I've seen on projects in the past where a few options have been developed, but pretty much all of them have poor outcomes. And that's something I really always try to emphasize for any project phase is do take the time to develop options that solve problems in a good way and then do your MCA. So I pushed really hard for the team to come up with good options. And as we went on, it actually became a routine for the broader team to input early on that these meetings would just get organised by others once people saw the benefits of it. And good options emerged out of that because the design team had access to more information on the wider risks. So this next slide is just talking about those considerations for ECN-1 credit, and we can move on to the next slide. And I won't spend much time on options assessment itself, as this is something that most projects have good tools for. The key is involving the right specialists and testing the outcomes. And sometimes the result isn't as expected. So as humans, we need to have a closer look at whether the criteria and scoring are making sense and adjust things if needed. And then document the outcomes in line with ECN-1. And I would definitely recommend doing that as you go along and to take a bit of care with that, because trying to pull things together later is kind of a nightmare, and we had a bit of a mix, I have to be honest, with that. So next slide, the technical manual. The aim, I suppose, as set out in the technical manual is to incorporate sustainability criteria and whole of life considerations into decision-making processes for significant project decisions. In other words, the way that I think about that is we need to understand what's important in the project's wider context, and we need to make decisions with long-term benefits in mind. For our project, that meant being really clear on the problem, identifying good solutions, and getting the whole team involved. So next slide, the benefits for the EastLink project that we found from using this process. I've given a few general benefits here, as well as a few specific examples of where the project achieved better outcomes by following this process. So at Bakers Hill, as I already mentioned, that process really helped us with sense making. There was another section where the alignment impacted on part of a tributary to the Susanna Brook. And there were technical issues there were land use and environmental considerations. And so having a tool that helped us to sort through those kept the team on track and led to avoiding most of the impacts to that tributary and shifting the alignment out of there. We also had a couple of interchanges in the urban area where we considered amenity alongside technical aspects and reached a much better outcome for those communities as well. So to close, I'd say my main messages would be from what we learned on EastLink. Our upfront review of the decision types really helped us to develop a process that was suited to our project. Even though we didn't have perfect information, the expertise of our environment, our urban design lead, our stakeholder engagement lead, and engineering leads meant that we could still assess what was important and still keep to the timeframes we had to work through as well. And as we started to do this more often, the documentation and capture of evidence definitely became more routine and easier to use for the ECN-1 credit as well. So that was all I had on EastLink. So now for a bit more on the delivery phase, I'll hand over to Lee.
Thank you, Sophie. I can't start my video, but hi everybody, I'm Lee Penny. I'm the Senior Sustainability Manager here at Laing O'Rourke. Next slide, please. So I'm going to be talking about design and as-built implementation for the credit, but before I start, I'd just like to do a quick acknowledgement of country. So we'd like to begin by acknowledging the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, and obviously the people of New Zealand as the traditional custodians of the places that we come together. Next slide, please. So just a quick overview. I oversee two large Metronet projects here in the West. So the Byford Rail Extension Project, which is 8 kilometres of rail extension south from Armidale to Byford. There's 2 new train stations and a 1.6 kilometre elevated viaduct that removes unsafe level crossings, upgrades of civil infrastructure and a lot of public open spaces that'll be created as part of the project. And then the Morley to Ellenbrook Line project, which is 21 kilometres of new double track rail and 5 new train stations, a lot of significant structures, so road over rail, viaducts, etc. And again, significant landscaping footprint and precinct development for the project. Next slide, please. Quick overview of the process is what I wanted to go through that we implemented on the project. So as you can tell, they're pretty big projects. As Sophie mentioned, the early phases of implementation is where you get the biggest bang for buck. But when you're in delivery phase, we need to have a very robust, nimble process to be able to implement and infiltrate into decision making. So we had to pivot and adjust for those projects. I'd like to also talk about, Sophie sort of touched on it, but how we dealt with the different levels and types of decisions as well, how we grappled with the social cost of carbon for the new version 2.1 tool and how we implemented a process there. And then I'll give you some examples of what our outcomes were and then some lessons learned to wrap up. Next slide, please. Okay, so for us, our significant decisions process, when we took on this this credit for the Morley to Ellenbrook line project, we didn't have the robust definition of what significant means in the new 2.1 manual because at that point we had adopted 2.0. It was just newly released. So the project sat down with our senior leadership team and we really went through to define what was going to trigger a significant decision and the process for multi-criteria analysis. So on screen there is the definitions that we came up with. And when we implemented this process and made it better on the Byford Rail Extension project, it hadn't really changed too much when we were implementing version 2.1. So we've really just sort of adopted what was already there. I want to touch on what Declan mentioned about that integration of different credits. So that's why we've defined there, a couple of different credits that we thought were pivotal in including in our decision-making process and what the triggers were for significant, because there is a lot of interconnection. Next slide, please. So this is really the process that we followed. As Sophie mentioned, we went through a process of developing different options very old example at the bottom, but essentially, take example of power supply to our site offices. So I work for a contractor. We had a range of different options. Probably what's not listed there is renewable energy, which we went through a process for our off-grid sites. But we then took it to finalizing the options list, and that was usually done in a workshop. But in some instances, if it is a decision that doesn't need multi stakeholders input, we would sort of define that. The process then would look at eliminating things that weren't feasible. So in this instance, biodiesel, because we don't have a supply at the moment in Perth. And then we'd go on to then evaluate the feasible options in my multi-criteria analysis workshop. So we developed a template and a process of scoring, and then eventually at the end of that process, we would then get a ranking of all the different options. Next slide, please. Very small, I'm sure, for you to see, but essentially we developed a process flow just because it started to get, once we gained a bit of momentum and we implemented a few of these, it was starting to get a little bit confusing as to, the go, no goes. And, as Sophie mentioned, things aren't always as quantifiable as they look. And so we needed to get some solutions for the teams when you face that problem. So when it's not so easy to monetize a decision, and then when we sort of built the social cost of carbon into it and we don't have carbon figures, there needed to be a process for the team to follow for the next steps. We also had to define our cross-discipline engagement as part of the process because, there are some decisions that require significant stakeholders to be around the table and a full multi-criteria workshop to occur, but there's a lot of decisions that don't need that same type of involvement and really just slow down the process and sometimes can hamstring the decision if we've got to get too many people involved. So we defined minor, medium, and significant engagement for cross-discipline for our MCAs, and you'll see that there on the screen. Next slide, please. I guess going through the level 2 I guess, adoption of the social cost of carbon and valuing that, we really did grapple with this in the beginning phases, because at that point there hadn't been, a lot of guidance in the market around what the dollar figure was for a ton of carbon. Initially, we looked at the ACT, who had, they were the first jurisdiction to put a dollar value at $20 a ton. We looked at different countries and their approaches to it, but ultimately we landed on $120 a ton of carbon for our project, with a discount rate of 2.5% for our life cycle of the initiative decision. And that really came down to basing our research on the US social cost of carbon models, because these were the most robust, they were the most frequently cited, they had been adopted by many countries. It also aligned with then the new guidance that came out from the New South Wales government. It aligned quite well with that $123 per tonne of carbon. So that's what we adopted for the project. Next slide, please. But then we face some hurdles around not being able to quantify that tonne of carbon, certainly in some instances for decisions that were a bit more complex, and it wasn't clear without full-scale life cycle models what that tonne of carbon is for each decision. And like I say, we needed it to be nimble, we needed it to be practical, we needed it to be something that didn't take months and months to go through a process of. So we then decided, look, when the tons of carbon are available, particularly for any kind of materials decisions, we would use our AusLCA database, or we would use an equivalent, the IS materials calculator, for example, to get that ton of carbon per decision. If we didn't have that, then we use the University of Melbourne, their EPIC database, which essentially puts a dollar value on an industry ton of carbon. So we're able to then, at least if we can value and we've monetized the decision for each option, we're able to then take that monetized value for each option to then put a dollar value for carbon and then move to the next process. Next slide, please. So I'll go into the tool that we developed and just sort of touch on some of the aspects that we've got in our decision-making process or multi-criteria analysis tool. So obviously those are the different aspects that we look at, and then we've got categories within those aspects that we look at as well. I've got to say this isn't static for every decision. It does change and evolve. What's missing off the financial aspects is the social cost of carbon, but essentially, if we had potentially, if we were looking at a renewable decision for our construction sites, we might look at disposal costs or revenue from disposal for some of those assets, because then that helps with the decision for our team as well, because the life cycle of those assets is longer than we would be constructing for. So taking all of that into account really helps get some of those innovations over the line. Top right-hand side, you can see each of the categories' weightings. And obviously, we've got cost as the highest weighting there, because if it wasn't, it'd be hard for our senior leadership team to take it as seriously. But yeah, that's what we've decided as a group. Next slide, please. This is our template in all its glory. And essentially, the big box call out on the right is a very simple scoring mechanism. We needed to keep it as simple for the project teams to be able to implement it, but essentially -3 is obviously a very negative, it's strongly negative, the decision in comparison to the other options, sorry, or +3, which is strongly positive, or neutral. There's no difference between the two options. So any range of that, and we've defined what that is in our template. What you'll see is in that column, you have the ability to put the scoring in -3 to +3, and then you've got the category weighting. And then what you get at the end is a weighted score. And then what happens after we've gone through the process with the team is that the green boxes at the bottom will then highlight what the final score is from a weightings perspective. And then it becomes really clear to the team, and it helps me sort of get initiatives over the line, or talk to the team around, it's very clear what the best option is for the project. Next slide, please. So just some quick examples, because I don't want to run over time, but one of the good examples we had on the Byford Rail Extension project was our steel selection procurement. Essentially, we had obviously we've got different suppliers with different carbon values for their products. We had a lot of resistance from our delivery team in using the more sustainable option because we'd had some issues potentially with delivery on another project. And so we sat down and went through an MCA process to really kind of give the team, particularly the commercial and procurement team, an idea of holistically what is the best outcome. And then we were able to have a conversation around, okay, well, why don't we have a win-win, or we could have a win-win scenario where we split the package, and where there's delivery constraints for our viaduct, for example, that's very program critical, we could then go with the preferred supplier from the engineer's perspective, but then for everything else, we're able to go for the more sustainable option. And so that was a really good result. And as it turns out, the inverted commas reliable supplier has ended up not being as reliable. So we've got this great backup with the sustainable supplier as well. Next slide, please. I'll really just touch on these very, very quickly. We at our Byford site compound, we were able to tap into a grid connection. We looked at opportunities to install solar rooftop PV for that compound, even though we were connected to the grid, and we went through a process to do that. Obviously, we don't get the same return on investment, but the MCA showed us it was the right thing to do for the project, so we implemented it. Next slide, please. Electric vehicle chargers, again, this was with the Morley-Ellenbrook line. We looked at payback of the infrastructure for our clients. We did a feasibility study and we looked at all the different options, obviously not knowing what the right number was, and looking at the CapEx costs and OpEx costs to then make the decision around what would be a feasible option for the client to implement. So that was a really good outcome. Next slide, please. And last but not least, our solar generator at Whiteman Park. As you can see, we had many, many options to look at, and going through this process helped us to kind of quiet the noise, because it was hard to compare apples with apples when you looked at it as just each quote coming in. But it was really good to be able to go through this process and really kind of put a bit of rigor around what was going to be the best option for us. So this was able to help us get this state first over the line, and it's been a really good outcome. Next slide, please. So I'll finish on lessons learned just quickly. As Sophie mentioned, embedding this process early and getting senior leadership team buy-in is critical. Tagging onto existing processes to ensure it happens is also critical. We've implemented this in our management of change process. So we've just sort of infiltrated something that we do anyway as a project, and we've added a couple of columns to that tracker to say, is this going to trigger an MCA, or is this decision a significant decision, yes or no? And then it triggers on that process flow. I guess something that's really important, and it's been touched on a lot, is we've got to make it fit for purpose, make it fit the project and the decisions. It needs to be agile, it needs to be implementable, because if it starts to become cumbersome, it really does hamstring you, and people start to don't see the value in it anymore and lose momentum. So really do make it fit for your project. Hold your teams accountable as well, and ensure that there's widespread use. We ran a lot of training sessions with the teams to make them comfortable with going through the process, and eventually it started to be embedded into our design teams, and they were running these without us from a sustainability perspective, which was fantastic because it was working, and they were finding a lot of value out of it as well, and being able to talk to the client around why they'd gone with different decisions. So as many people implementing this on the project as possible is really what you want to get out of it. As I mentioned, I'm sure we're not the only ones to grapple with how you define the social cost of carbon and how you make it workable for each decision, but you really think about how you approach that. because what we were finding with the lower values is that they weren't making a very big impact on the decision. So that's why we chose to go as high as possible for our social cost of carbon, because otherwise it really doesn't make much of a difference. And I guess just to sort of reiterate how it's really helped us to implement a lot of initiatives and innovations for the project, because when you are just comparing BAU CapEx in decision making, there are a lot of things that get lost, particularly from a renewables implementation perspective. So it really does help kind of hit that message home with people that talk in numbers versus carbon emissions. So I'd really encourage you to use that to help your innovations process as well. That's all I wanted to talk about. So thanks very much.
Thanks, Lee. That was brilliant. And let me just quickly now hand over to Sam. Sam is going to, also from Lane O'Rourke, is going to take a different view, I guess, around integrating sustainability into decision making, and just talk to us about how this type of process is being used within Lane O'Rourke and how that connects to the projects that they do. Thanks so much, Sam. And just, I see we've got a few questions. We may be short on time, but we'll be sure to come back if we don't get to answer them all. Cheers, Sam.
Thanks, Kerry, and hello, everyone. Yes, and my name's Sam Donaldson. I'm the Hub Sustainability Leader for Laing O'Rourke. I've been with Laing O'Rourke for just over 12 years, that is. And one of the initiatives that I've really enjoyed the experience being part of shaping and developing is what I'm going to talk to you about today, which is the Responsible Decision Making Strategic Initiative. This was led out of the Australian hub, and then it was also picked up and deployed right across the group of Laing O'Rourke. This was really introduced to formalise our decision-making process, because at this time in 2019, we just actually launched our new purpose and value statement, which was around the mission to become the recognised leader for innovation and engineering excellence. So we really wanted to have a framework, a decision-making process that allowed our people to align and support the achievement of that particular mission. So I wanted to talk about it because it actually supports and lands really nicely with the intent of the economics credit in version 2.1 of the tool. Certainly this is more for a corporate setting, but it can also be deployed at a project level. And it also supports with the intent of what we're trying to achieve out of the MAN 7 credit if you're tackling version 1.2 of the tool. I'll be sharing a little bit around our journey with responsible decision making. I'll talk about why it was introduced, how we went about trying to embed it in the business. I'll give you an overview of what it looks like very briefly. And then I'll also talk about some of the advantages of having corporate-based responsible decision-making frameworks, or MCAs, in the business to support project-based decision-making. So I might just go to the next slide, if that's okay, Lauren. So you might be looking at this slide and thinking to yourself, why is there a photo of an elephant here? So outside of this being my daughter's favorite animal, it's actually a really nice metaphor that speaks to the work of a renowned psychologist called Daniel Kahneman. And some people on the call may actually know a really famous book that he developed around how people think about things, and it's called Think Fast and Think Slow. And he has found that really there's two sort of systems of how people think about situations and make decisions on those situations. So systems one, this is think fast. This is fast, intuitive, almost like impulsive type decision making. And it's a little bit like the elephant in the photo here. So the elephant is moving without much thought. It's quite automative in terms of its movement. But one of the things that's important is just by the sheer size of the animal, it can also be quite hard to control. The second type of thinking is systems two thinking, and this is where it's about thinking slow. So it's really deliberate, thoughtful. You look at a range of different aspects. You look short and long term, and it's a little bit like the rider on the elephant here. So he's being as calculated as he can to, I suppose, control the movements of the elephant, but he's also limited in his capacity to control the elephant because of the sheer size of the elephant, and they also often have a mind of its own. So The work here out of this book has really showed that MCAs are really important, or responsible decision-making frameworks are really important, because people are usually thinking in one of those systems separately, and it's not harmonious. So when people can go into a problem and try and come to a solution, if they don't have a framework there, they can be quite biased, or they can have an impulsive reaction around what is the right option to move forward with. So this was a real big reason why we wanted to introduce the responsible decision-making framework in Laing O'Rourke, because we had a purpose, we had a new mission statement, and we wanted to have a number of values that got people thinking more broadly, got them thinking more rationally and thoughtful, so that they could align with that new purpose and mission statement. At the time as well, if you could go back to that slide, please. At the time as well, we also had a number of complex situations coming through to our execs to make decisions on. So everyone was grappling with the pandemic. That posed a number of challenging situations for us to act on to keep the heartbeat of the organisation pouncing. We also had a number of sort of dilemmas or challenges around opportunistic projects to look at, and also some potential impacts to our workforce that essentially wanted us to force us go through a responsible decision-making process. Also at the time, we're about to launch some ambitious targets around environmental and social aspects. So carbon reduction, net zero type targets. We also had a number of bold commitments in diversity and inclusion, gender parity. So we really wanted to make sure that those ambitions came into our people's decision-making processes, so that they could support those commitments that we're about to introduce. In terms of the responsible decision-making framework, I think this has been shared quite clearly with Lee and also Sophie. We really wanted to set up something that was simple in its process, so that people could also pick it up and use it right across the business quite easily. Also, this responsible decision-making framework wasn't set up to support people's daily decisions. So we know that our staff make hundreds of decisions every single day right across the business. They make really good decisions in the business. This was more for those complex, challenging situations where there's a number of different trade-offs and tensions, and there's not an obvious answer around what you should be carrying forward to act on that problem. We also went through a pretty significant development process to influence what the responsible decision-making framework should look like. A range of different interviews, workshops that helped collect about 700 data insights that went into influencing what the architecture and the block should look like for the framework that we've now introduced in the business. Next slide, if that's okay. So this slide speaks to how we wanted to embed responsible decision-making into the business. We really wanted to make sure that it was integrated into Laing O'Rourke's operating philosophy. We didn't want to just create a new tool, a separate work stream. We wanted to go through a number of different areas so that really became part of our business and our people's thinking. So there's 3 areas that we focused on integrating and embedding the framework in the business. Firstly was triggers, and this is almost like another definition for what we consider to be significant decisions under the IS manual. So there are times where we're going to have to use the responsible decision-making framework separately and go through the whole formal process. And this could be for exec-based decisions or senior leadership type decisions. The second one that we wanted to integrate the RDM framework within was that we already knew that there was a number of MCA type approaches that functions were using in the business. So in our procurement function around how they select suppliers and subcontractors, in our clients and markets, which is our tender stream, they also have like bid scoring frameworks. Even in our human capital function, they have a number of different options assessment frameworks. So we actually wanted to integrate as much as possible the principles and the value areas that we selected under the framework into those processes. So it just became part of BAU for our functions. And then the last one was that we really wanted to set a whole new culture for systems thinking and going through options and assessments and the importance of it. So this was our soft wiring approach, which was setting a new tone, a new standard of how people should be thinking and acting on a range of different problems that come through. So we actually spent a significant amount of effort in terms of training and upskilling our execs. They went full through programs to understand, the whole purpose of systems thinking. We took them through the process. We also did that for senior leaders across the business. And we also chose a number of different critical functions in the business that we know need to make decisions around complex and challenging situations. So in human capital, procurement, and also our clients and market stream are 3 areas that we trained up our senior leaders in those 3 functions for the responsible decision-making framework. If we could go to the next slide, please. So this is a slide to present an overview of what Laing O'Rourke's responsible decision-making framework looks like. It's a 4-step simple process to follow, purposely built that way so that it's easy for leaders across the business or teams to pick up and deploy. I can't share Laing O'Rourke's values, so we've got 8 value areas that we ask all of our people to make a decision on and assess options against. And that's because it's quite confidential, sensitive to the Laing O'Rourke business. But what I'm going to do is just go from left to right of screen and just articulate some of the key, I suppose, outputs that we're looking to get out of each of those 4 stages. So the first stage is inform stage. And this is really about informing the problem. Like, what's the problem that we're trying to solve here? From that problem, what's the desired output or purpose that we're trying to achieve? And this is about really bringing in the information to contextualize what that problem looks like. It means bringing in the right stakeholders for information gathering. And it's at this stage that we ask the stakeholders that are involved in either the information gathering or could be impacted by this particular situation to explore a range of different options to essentially solve that problem. And we ask them to really try and find at least 4 options that could be considered as the right way forward to solve that problem, just to get them thinking more broadly and also force them to think a little bit outside the box as well. So the first stage is all about the information gathering stage, setting the problem, and also identifying options. Then we move into the second stage, which is make the decision stage. And I suppose there's 2 key outputs that we're looking to achieve under this particular area. The first is that we get all of our stakeholders that are involved in the options assessment to go for a risk and opportunities assessment, and we get them to do an R&O over the short, medium, and longer term horizon. And we get them to think about risk and opportunities against environmental, financial, and social aspects for each of the different options. And this is just to get them to understand what could be some of the posed benefits or impacts for each of those options against environmental, social, and financial matters. It gets them into a good space of understanding also what could be the potential longer term impacts or benefits for each of those options against the triple bottom line. It's from there that we then get them to move into the actual options assessment using the MCA that we've developed that aligns with Laing O'Rourke's value areas. We've got 8 value areas that each option needs to be assessed against. And we've built a number of different templates to help guide people in going through each of these stages. So for that particular area, we've developed what's called like a scoring criteria, which is to help them inform judgment around whether it's a negative, neutral, or positive impact to each of those eight value areas for the options that we're assessing. From there, we're able to identify what could be the preferred option that we'd like to move forward with, and then we need to decide on what's the option that we're going to act on. Then we move into the third stage, which is quite simply acting on the decision or the option that we've made a decision for to move forward with, and then having a communication plan in place so that stakeholders are well aware of what decision we're moving forward with and how it could actually impact them in their own roles or the teams that they're working in. And then the fourth one is a reflect stage. So this is something that we don't do straight after completing stages 1 to 3. We might do this 6 months or a year down the track. This is about at a certain stage, trying to measure the outcome of the decision that we've selected to move forward with. Did it actually meet the desired impact or purpose that we had initially set up in the informed stage? And are there any continuous improvement change type initiatives that we'd like to introduce into our responsible decision-making framework moving forward? We've used it at the corporate level for about 24 decisions or significant decisions or problems that we've had to solve, and that's been from a range of different things related to COVID, opportunistic projects, even policies that we've had to set, introduce in the business that impacts our people or benefits our people, I should say. Moving on to the last slide before I hand back. So I just wanted to present here, and I won't go through every single list of bullet points here because I don't have enough time, but this just articulates some of the big advantages that I see by having corporate MCAs and how they can shape project-based decisions. So the first one is that you've got alignment with strategic goals straight away. So if a project was to utilise, a Langer Hawke project was to utilise the responsible decision-making framework, they can shore up with certainty that the decisions that they're making is aligned with Langer Hawke's purpose and value areas. Second one is consistency and efficiency in decision making. Something that I see, left, right, and centre is that we're always constantly recreating MCAs from scratch. Well, here's a tool that's available, and it might be not the full tool that would be used on a project, but it's a good starting point at least. The third one is because we spend a lot of time with training, mentoring, upskilling our staff, for projects to use or adopt RDM in a particular way, it's much easier for them to justify decisions and help get the business to support those decisions as well, because it aligns with our core value areas. Now, there's some of the advantages, but obviously there needs to be some considerations as well. So, this has been set up specifically for Langer Hawke. So, for projects, particularly in contracts like alliances, joint ventures, you need to appease a number of different stakeholder values there. So obviously RDM would need to be adjusted so that it supports a number of the stakeholders that are involved in those alliance or collaborative type contracts. And then the last one before I just close was that, this is sort of something where we actually set up a framework where we don't have weightings at all across all the different social, financial, and environmental value areas. But I also do appreciate that on some projects, particularly in the technical area where you're trying to go through a number of different options there, is that you may want to actually introduce some weightings in the technical space or cost space, really depending on what is the situation that you're wanting to make a decision on. So that's also something that would need to be considered on projects as well. So hopefully I've left you with, potentially a bit of an overview of Langer Hawke's responsible decision-making framework and maybe even a few ideas that you could bring back to your own business or projects that you're working on. And I'll hand back to Kerry.
Great. Thanks, Sam. Really appreciate that kind of broader context and also connecting it to projects. Now, I'm conscious that we just have a couple of minutes here. Lee, let me just ask you one of these questions, and for those that we don't answer here, we'll make sure that we come back to the participants. The social cost of carbon, how is that incorporated into the MCA?
So we have it in our template under the cost category. And so it gets a higher weighting because cost category has got that 50% weighting. So you would have seen in the template that that it's one of the sort of line items under that category. And then we obviously have to do a bit of work prior to the MCA, filling in that MCA template to kind of get what that ton of carbon is for each option. And then we go through that. And usually what we'd have is most of those cost elements pre-filled prior to the MCA so that we're not trying to work all that out on the fly. So we'll have that, and it's very clear, the costs are very clear to the team, so we can rank each option plus minus whatever the score is.
Right. Thanks, Lee. Hey, I'd just like to thank those who put in additional questions, Zoe, Danielle and Ross. We'll definitely come back to you. And Ross, I note something around a suggestion for another webinar, which is great, but we're on time now. So I'd just like to take this opportunity to really a big thank you to our presenters today, to Sophie Wallace from BG&E and to Lee Penny and Sam Donaldson from Langer Hawke for sharing their learnings, projects and insights, and also some of the challenges. Also for Declan for kind of setting the scene for us. Really appreciate all of those who have joined us on the call. As you go out from the webinar, you'll notice a survey. We'd love you to feed that in to provide your feedback and any suggestions for future topics as well. And just again, thanks all for participating, for coming along. It's these opportunities to learn from one another that really will drive improved sustainability outcomes over time. So thanks again, kia ora, ka kite to everyone, and have a good rest of your day. Cheers.